Well, hello and welcome back. This is the second talk in a series of 7 with Carmelite history from the 16th century onward. Today's talk is entitled Teresa's Reform, Conflict and Division. And it's one of those areas of Carmelite history and heritage that is very well documented. There are many good books on it, but the ones that I'm recommending for our purposes would be the second section of Father Joachim Smet's shorter work. This would be the first 4 chapters in that volume, pages 73 to 125. Then to follow up with Peter Thomas Rohrbach, his chapter 5 is devoted entirely to this episode, pages 137 to 169. Not a terribly long section, but very well done and loads of very good, accurate material. And then finally, in my own book, Desert Springs in the City, you'll find this material in chapter 6, pages 83 through 99. You can read these in any order, it really doesn't matter. It all covers the same material, but it's kind of important that you try to have a certain carryover when you're reading and just keep knitting together the various elements. Okay, just as a reprise, remember that during this century of the 1500s, there's an awful lot going on. In the world at large, people are getting used to the fact that the voyages of Columbus and the Portuguese explorers have opened up the rest of the world to trade, travel, exploration, colonization, migration of people and animals and plants and, sadly, diseases. This is the period known as the Columbian Exchange, where one part of the world has discovered ways to go to the other parts of the world safely and to come back in one piece, and of course exotic new products, different sources of wealth, taking farm animals or domestic plants, foodstuffs to areas where they have never been before, and usually with rather good results. Sadly, the diseases are always unusual and deadly in many cases because notably Native Americans have no natural immunity against many diseases that had been common in Europe. For Europeans to come down with something like measles is a nuisance. For a Native American, it was probably the sentence of death. So there's a lot happening just in the world of civilian activity. In the political world, we're seeing the growth of what we call new monarchies. Notable examples would be Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella, England under Henry VII and Henry VIII, and then later in the century, Elizabeth I, probably the greatest of all of the Tudors, and also the solidification of the monarchy in France, notably King Francis I and his son Henry II. These are the latest of the Valois dynasty. There will be 3 more Valois kings, but definitely not nearly as competent as their father and grandfather had been. You'll also remember that during this period, most of Central Europe fell inside the dark border that you see on this map. This is the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor for most of the century was Charles V, a member of the Habsburg family. Charles is also simultaneously King of Spain, King of the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, also Duke or Grand Duke or Archduke of the Austrian crown lands, including Central Austria, as well as Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia, parts of Hungary. Much of Hungary has by now been conquered by the Ottoman Turks, so that puts Charles in the primary blocking position to try to keep the Turks out of Europe. This is going to be one of his main concerns, and although he was largely successful in halting the march of the Ottoman Turkish armies, it was a very difficult task, which kept him occupied when he probably would have been interested in doing other things like containing France or helping to solve the Protestant Reformation. During the period of the Reformation, we have a great deal of Northern Europe, notably the Scandinavian countries, most of the North German states, some of the Baltic principalities, all embracing the Lutheran Church and the Lutheran version of Protestantism. At the same time, you have John Calvin with an alternate type of Protestant belief. This is heavily focused on the idea of predestination, in which people at birth are already known to God to be destined for heaven or hell, and that predestination teaching is going to touch practically everything else in the Calvinist way of evangelization. And then finally, we're going to have a third Protestant variant beginning in England as the nationalized Church of England. Henry VIII was the one who separated the English Church from Rome, but interestingly did not change any of the doctrines or teachings. The teachings that did change happened largely under his son, King Edward, and also his daughter, Elizabeth I. By the end of the century, it was a true Protestant church, but definitely more like the Catholic parent church than either of the other two Protestant beliefs. So, with the splitting of Christianity in the West between Catholic and Protestant communions, we're going to trigger the need for a more urgent and more sweeping Catholic reform at the Council of Trent. At this particular time, the Carmelites were struggling to hold themselves together, and sadly there were several provinces that were altogether lost, notably the provinces of Saxony and Denmark in Northern Europe, as well as England, Scotland, and Ireland. Each of those provinces was extinguished by Protestant rulers who saw no advantage or usefulness of religious orders of any sort. During most of this period, the Prior General was Nicholas Audet. Nicholas did a yeoman job of trying to support and encourage the surviving provinces in Northern Europe, and he, together with several heroic provincials, were largely responsible for maintaining a presence in Germany and Belgium and most of the central part of Europe. The provinces in France are going to be largely left alone as far as their existence, but they're going to be damaged very badly in a series of 8 separate wars of religion between the French Protestants, known as Huguenots, and the remaining Catholic Church. So that leads us to our subject for today. Teresa's reform was largely confined to the second half of the century. Teresa got much of her own grounding in Carmelite spirituality and lore in the early part of the century, but the beginning of what we call the Teresian reform had to wait until somewhat later. Following the Council of Trent, much of the reform in Spain is going to take fire because of good legislation coming from the Ecumenical Council. If you look at the green lines on this map, this shows Carmelite houses the way they are today in the Carm branch of the order. You'll see that there is a distinct province of Portugal, which was, of course, an independent state. And then you see 4 Spanish provinces, Castile in the north, Andalusia in the south, Aragon in the east, and Catalonia in the northeast. These are the 4 provinces that exist today, and these are the ones that were also in existence largely at the time of Teresa's reform and all of the events there. So it might help to keep that in mind. Following the death of Nicholas Audet, the new prior general is Giovanni Battista Rossi. Rossi was another very good reformer, wound up being a personal friend of Teresa's and a staunch supporter of reform the way that she was doing it. You see that he was general between 1562 and 1578. Rossi is also the person who comes up in much of the literature identified as Rubeo. Rubeo is a more Spanish version of his name. Rossi was Italian, from Ravenna, I believe. And since he inherited the direction of the order immediately following the Council of Trent, it also meant that he was going to be very busy trying to communicate all of the new regulations to the component provinces of the Carmelite world. Trent had said a great deal about discipline and training, as well as ordinary religious life for priests and religious, and just getting that word out to people in the far reaches of the Carmelite world is going to be a great deal of work. It involves mailing and communication by word of mouth when possible, and a lot of printing of new books, revision of Carmelite liturgy, updates of Carmelite constitutions in harmony with the Trent legislation, and even without the need to travel to different provinces, Rossi had a lot of it on his plate just doing paperwork in Rome. And yet, like Audet and John Soreth before him, he certainly saw that changing the way of life and the acceptance of new things was an uphill fight. Many religious were hesitant to change the way of living that they had followed for so many years. So Rossi was aware that traveling out and visiting provinces, especially the major houses, whenever he could get to them, was the best way of trying to communicate not only the details, but the excellence of the new legislation and the very good reasons why people should adopt it willingly. Much of that early paperwork delayed his travels, sadly. As you see, he was the first general to actually visit the Iberian Peninsula. There had been independent provinces in Spain and Portugal for a long time. A few of the earliest generals were from the Catalonian province, so technically they had been to Spain. But there had never been a proper visit by the prior general of those places. Now, Rossi was under a certain amount of pressure from the King of Spain to take a hand in the reform of the Spanish provinces, so that was always something in the back of his mind. In Spain, the 4 provinces were going to go through a whole range of excellence or lack of it. The Castilian province was certainly the best as far as observance and fervor was concerned. Some of the representatives of Nicholas Audet and before him of John Sorath had visited the various provinces in Spain and had urged the kind of reform that all of them were going to need. Castile especially bought into the reform and managed to hammer out legislation for its own members that were very good elements in getting religious life back on track. It's interesting that the Castilian province actually had a lot of discussion and debate about the quality of this new reform, and approximately half of the friars deserted the province because they simply felt they couldn't live with the new regulations. They hadn't committed themselves to that. They took their vows to what amounts to a sloppier way of life, and so basically they said, well, we're not going to follow. So the numbers in Castile were down, but the quality, the fervor of the ones who remained was very, very good. So this was easily the best of the 4 Spanish provinces. As a footnote, the Portuguese province was also in very good shape. The foundation of Portugal had taken place a bit late in the game, but you'll remember that St. Nuno Alvarez Pereira, second most important person in in Portugal after the king, was one of the co-founders of the expansion of houses in Portugal. And the regulations that he had placed on the Carmo in Lisbon, as well as other Carmelite houses that followed, kept them very much disciplined and focused on prayer and religious life. So thanks to Nuno, Portugal was still steaming along beautifully and was no headache at all to the prior general or anyone else. The eastern provinces in Spain, of Aragon and Catalonia, were in the process of reforming themselves. They had gotten the word that new things were expected. Stricter observance was the law of the land now. It wasn't just the opinion of the prior general, but it was backed up by solid legislation from the Universal Church, thanks to the Council of Trent. So Aragon and Catalonia were not completely reformed yet, but they were on the way and working at it seriously. The province of Andalusia in the south was the problem. This is the biggest of the Spanish provinces, but it was also the worst as far as observance of just basic religious order, discipline, prayer, basic morality. The Andalusian province was in very bad shape. There were 3 brothers of the Nieto family who held all of the reins of power in Andalusia. The 3 Nietos were named Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. Father Joachim points out quickly that the names of the three wise magi were the only good things that the Nietos had to their credit. Everything else was blatant corruption. The Nietos had placed many of their friends in the priorships of the major houses. They had control of all of the wealth of the province, and they essentially were using the wealth and power of provincial leadership to give themselves luxurious and immoral lives, while many of the ordinary friars were going hungry or lacking enough fuel to keep them warm during the winters, or decent medical care, all kinds of details that people take for granted in a province that's running well. Well, the Nietos had seen to it that Andalusia was going to be for their ease and comfort and nothing else. So by the time Rossi arrived in Andalusia, he very quickly discovered that he had his work cut out for him. Most of the Spanish church at this time, thank God, was in a state of reforming. Several things had happened earlier than the Reformation to purify and strengthen the Spanish church. So Teresa's reform is actually going to take place in a relatively friendly atmosphere countrywide. The nuns themselves had been established only recently in Spain. The corruption of some of the friars' houses did not extend to the women's communities. Most of them were less than 100 years old. Remember that there were no Carmelite nuns in the order until 1452, when John Soreth obtained the cum nulla bull from the Pope authorizing women's communities and the opening of Carmel to laymen and women as well. So all of the sisters' communities in Spain, although they were not tightly disciplined, none of them were actually anything that you and I would call corrupt. There were simply things that needed to happen, but were able to happen without too much difficulty. One other complication to the reform in Spain is the king. This is Philip II of Spain. Philip is the son of the former Emperor Charles V. His title in Spain was Charles I of Spain. After 1555, when Charles stepped down, his son Philip took over the reins of Spain and the elements of the Spanish Empire. Remember, that includes the Netherlands, southern Italy, several islands in the Mediterranean, and all of the claims of the Spanish crown in the New World. At the time of Philip, this included the former Indian empires in Mexico and Peru, a great number of gold and silver mines, sources of precious gems, as well as very practical products that still had a high commercial value. Things like rice, cotton, indigo, farm products of any sort, and the benefits of the very high quality agriculture that the Spaniards found and built in America. All of these economic values were going to strengthen the Spanish monarchy and make it, at least for almost 2 centuries, probably the strongest in the world. Sadly, Philip was a very good Catholic. He was about as sincere a religious man as one can ever find. But his version of Catholicism was extremely rigid and straight-laced. He was firmly convinced that it was only the Spanish version of the Catholic Church that was truly worthy of God. He didn't like people from other countries. He didn't trust the Pope. He didn't like religious superiors. Most of them were Italians. He felt that these were people who were a bit too sloppy to reform the Spanish Church, and therefore the king begins with an attitude that all non-Spaniards need to keep their hands off of the Spanish Church and the Spanish orders, and he was perfectly willing to step in and do it himself if he felt that it wasn't being adequately done. Strangely, the really good legislation from the Council of Trent was something that Philip considered to be half-hearted. He was convinced that Trent didn't go far enough, that there needed to be stricter legislation, like use of the office of the Inquisition, for example. The Spanish Inquisition was the most rigid and frightening incarnation of the International Inquisition, which was essentially a study committee to determine whether certain religious teachings were Orthodox Catholic theology or not. In Spain, the Inquisition was not an arm of the church, but of the government. The Inquisition in Spain was largely governed by churchmen, but they were appointed by the state, by the crown, and they generally followed the very rigid style of Catholicism and felt perfectly free to investigate bishops and other religious leaders who didn't seem to be towing the mark the way that King Philip thought they should. This will also come in our own time to look at people like Teresa and John of the Cross, Ignatius Loyola, Francis Xavier, some of the greatest saints that Spain produced during this century. All of them were eventually found to be orthodox, and nothing was found wrong with their teaching, but the spirit of nosiness and intrusion is going to intimidate and frighten other religious leaders to the point where, when you look at the next century in Spain, you're not going to find dramatic leaders like Teresa or Ignatius who were doing things that were out of the ordinary and could be challenged by people who were largely looking backward rather than forward. One of the things that Philip did that is going to immediately concern the Carmelites was that he asked Rossi, the prior general, to appoint a special vicar for all of the Spanish Carmelite provinces. He was asking for a kind of super-provincial who could govern all of Spain, largely because he wanted one person to talk to in order to manipulate the Spanish Carmelites according to his own vision. Rossi very politely replied to him that it was the Carmelite custom that we do our own reforms, thank you very much, and I will, says Rossi, visit Spain myself to do the job within the next 2 years. If I fail to do that, then I will consider your request to appoint a vicar. So Rossi had given himself a deadline and a timetable to come to Spain and start doing the reform work that King Philip was asking. Now, among the political background of Teresa's Spain, we have several interesting things here. Remember that the Spanish church was already fairly good. There had been a Cardinal Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, who had been a chaplain for Queen Isabella. The Queen promoted him against his own wishes to be a bishop and then a cardinal and then a reformer of the whole Spanish church. But reluctant or not, Jimenez did a very good job. He put pressure on bishops and religious houses to conform to the proper church law for their respective responsibilities. He founded a new university, which would be the training ground for the better Spanish priests, and he did many other things that essentially kicked the Spanish church into shape to such a degree that by the time the Council of Trent met, the Spanish bishops were some of the best contributors because they had already been reformed. Together with King Philip's zeal to try to keep the more rigorous form of the Reformation going, it's sad that the king couldn't keep his fingers out of the pie. He was perfectly convinced that he knew more than most of the bishops and everyone in Rome about what the Spanish church needed. And as we're going to see, he's going to keep intruding and sometimes backing the wrong people in the Carmelite world. It's sad that the Nieto brothers of Andalusia had done what many corrupt leaders do. They had many friends in high places, people well connected in the royal court. So if the Nietos wanted to complain about their treatment to someone high and mighty, they could actually go all the way to the king, and at least for a short time be believed. This is going to complicate the whole Teresian reform to a huge degree. Looking at Spain through Teresa's eyes, remember that Spain had only finished pushing the Moors out of Spain in 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed westward through the Atlantic. Previously, there had been 700 years of Muslim domination of Spain during the intervening centuries. Sometimes the Muslim government was very good and quite beneficial to the ordinary people of Spain. At other times, it was rather fundamentalistic and actually hostile to Jews and Christians, forcing them to consider converting to Islam or suffering penalties. After the Muslims were expelled, one of the chief political ideas in the mind of people like King Philip was rooting out the remnants of Islamic teaching and customs, as well as trying to pressure the Jews of Spain to abandon Judaism and convert to the Catholic faith. This need of Philip especially, and many of the members of the Inquisition, is also going to be a shadow over much of the Spanish population. Remember that Teresa had a Jewish grandparent, and if that had been well known in Avila, she probably would not have been admitted to the Incarnation Convent. So this rather toxic view of non-Christian religions as being hostile and dangerous, it's going to poison much of the atmosphere that otherwise might have been a lot more tolerant and harmonious. The monarchs, including Charles and Philip and their successors, felt this strong need to have as much unity in the Spanish state as possible. and that's also going to color what follows. The reform of the church was already important and remaining so. The affairs of the church are going to be hugely complicated by Spanish customs. In many cases, there was no distinction between church and state. Many people at this time never thought that that would be a good idea to separate church and state. The assumption was both the mechanism of the political world and the hierarchy of the church were allies in a harmonious running of Spain, and they needed to cooperate with each other. One backs up and supports the other, and so forth. There were many social conventions as well, notably the idea of patronage for religious communities. There were many houses of men and women in Spain that were dedicated to religious life according to one form or another. In fact, there were so many that most religious communities assumed that they would not be able to support themselves or pay their bills unless there was a powerful family who had taken them under their wing, sometimes more than one family. Ones that would keep money flowing to be sure that the community did not suffer any kind of privation. But usually the patronage came with strings attached. The families that were supporting the religious frequently asked for burial in the churches of a monastery or convent. This was with the understanding that the religious would continue to pray for their benefactors, both living and dead. Many of the patron families were somewhat doubtful about their own ancestors, wondering if they really were in hell. So having a nice religious community to pray for their salvation might somehow change God's mind and allow them to be released from the flames. At least this was a vague thought that seemed to be in the background of some of them. In some extreme cases, the patron families put very specific conditions on the religious community. In some of the more extreme cases, they required a certain number of masses to be said, or certain very specific prayers for the family and their deceased ancestors, to such a degree that in order to get their subsidy money, the superiors of the community had to promise forever that these prayers would be said. This gets very close to outright superstition, unfortunately, but there was a surprising amount of it going on. In some of the most disgusting cases, a family could require that the nuns of a particular community had to have a sister in chapel 24 hours a day praying for the deceased members of the family. And they felt quite free to come into the chapel at any hour of the day to be sure that there was a sister on her knees actually moving her lips with prayer for the deceased family members. Otherwise, they could actually take the superiors of the community to court to enforce this. You can see quite easily that this is way out of hand. This is not religious life the way the founders intended it, and it certainly is not the type of Catholic belief that people today understand is the basis of God's relationship with us. Now, in Spain, by Teresa's time, there were 12 communities. Some of them had extremely good observance. I believe it's the Valencia community who had midnight office for the nuns. that was very devoutly prayed. That community and some of the others were extremely devout and had many holy women who were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Remember that all of them were founded after the time of John Soreth, so there were no communities that were more than 100 years old. All 12 of these houses were called beaterios. In other words, they were similar to the communities of the Beguines in Northern Europe. Holy women who came together for prayer and community, and sometimes service or apostolates of some limited type, but they were loosely organized, and the beaterio would never have a strict cloister or enclosure rule to keep people in or out, and they were generally not supervised closely by the local bishops or local spiritual directors. This was somewhat sloppier than an ideal strict religious community would be, but it doesn't necessarily translate to corruption. Nobody had simply told the nuns that they should have a strict enclosure, so it really wasn't their fault. But the days were coming that, especially in harmony with the legislation coming from the Council of Trent, all women's communities were eventually supposed to have strict rules of enclosure, doors that were watched night and day by a porter who would only admit people who were authorized and who would take note of people leaving the house for various legitimate reasons, with the eye toward making sure that all of the comings and goings were legitimate and necessary. But that's in the future. So far we don't have this in Spain, in any of those houses. Now this is Teresa's house. This is the Encarnacion, just outside the classic walls of Avila. It's a very beautiful house, as you can see. It was the largest of all of the Spanish Carmels. At Teresa's time, there were approximately 180 sisters that belonged to this community. That's far too many for anything like a community where most of the sisters know most of the others. And many of the people who were in the community were ones who had been placed there by their families. In many cases, a patron family would demand that one of their unmarried daughters or two of them be admitted to the community because they weren't likely to find husbands. And as a sweetener, the patrons would make a large donation in order to simply keep their daughters in fairly comfortable living conditions. But sadly, these were women who had no concept of what you and I would call a vocation. They didn't belong in religious life. They were not evil people. They were simply misplaced. They shouldn't have been there. And in order to while away their time, in many cases, these younger daughters who were dumped on the community would go through the motions of religious life, like going to chapel or refectory with their sisters, sometimes not. In many cases, they would have their own suites of rooms, sometimes with their own servants or their own slaves. They would sometimes have their own cooks who would take care of supplying their dietary needs. And in some cases, they would have a parlor room or two where friends from the outside would come and go at all hours of the day and night. These were people who were simply helping them pass the time and keep themselves entertained. So it was a matter of having non-religious people pretending to be religious and essentially representing a drag on community life the way that it was intended. Teresa entered the Incarnation Monastery in 1535. It was noteworthy once she got there that there were all kinds of nuns in the community. Some of them were good and holy women who would have been a credit to any community. She very quickly made friends with many of these other sisters, and they continued to be close friends from start to finish. But sadly, the large number of women in this facility, in spite of the fact of all of the donations of the patron families, the house itself was very poor. There was not enough income to provide proper food, clothing, medical care, heat for everyone who lived in the house. As a matter of fact, the total number of nuns was more than the house could accommodate, and as you might remember from reading some of Teresa's own writings, there were times when she was living outside of the convent with some wealthy woman or a patron or a friend of the community who had requested her presence. Sadly, many of these sisters were temporarily sent home to live with their families simply because the number of 180 nuns was too large for the community to handle. Obviously, this is not a good component for anything like religious life. But during that time, Teresa still spent almost the first 20 years of her religious life living very happily and very harmoniously with the Carmelite ideals. She read or learned much about Carmelite history and heritage and styles of prayer from the books that she had access to or the people she talked to, many of the sermons that were given in the monastic chapel. It built up her knowledge and her appreciation of Carmelite life. And of course, it's going to prod her very fertile mind into what the Carmelite life could be if the conditions could be made right. She had a personal conversion in 1554. There was a very small sculpture of Jesus tied to the pillar during his passion, suffering from the scourging and the abandonment of being mistreated in this way. Well, this image touched Teresa to the heart, and she very quickly said to Jesus, "You look so much alone and abandoned. There's no one with you. I can be with you, and I would like to do that for the rest of my years." And as you probably know already, at this point she fell to her knees and refused to move until God gave her the grace to continue with getting Carmelite life back into shape. She focused on the mitigated rule of 1247 and took that as the outline of her Reformed community. She was very familiar with one of the old Carmelite classics, The Institution of the First Monks, which had been in the library in Avila, and she certainly knew what was in it, even if maybe she didn't read the book personally. We don't know whether she had unlimited access to it or not, but she definitely knew the rather mythological ideals of Carmelite life, following Elijah and Mary. Their very simple, direct style of prayer was something that appealed to her very strongly, and she was able to build the details of her reform around that idea of prayer. Many religious reforms seem to be somewhat superficial because they focus on reforming the schedule or tightening discipline of various details of religious life rather than going for prayer itself. Teresa's reform is the powerful message that it is because prayer was the center and all of the other details were built around that. Teresa said in so many words that no prayer was better than a loving personal relationship with Jesus. She taught that prayer is nothing more than a warm, friendly conversation with someone who loves you dearly. That's the key to everything that followed. She sought out permission from the provincial of Castile, to found an experimental community. This was the convent of San Jose, which opened its doors in 1562. Teresa insisted that this community be founded, to use her phrase, in poverty, which means no patronage, no strings attached, with some family outside of the convent telling them what they could and could not do. From the start, Teresa's reform was by and for the nuns who lived in the community. They would run their own affairs, they would control their own finances, they would be able to request the spiritual directors and confessors that they wanted, rather than having all of these things done for them from outside. This is actually going to create some trouble for her in the early years. There were many of the people in the civic government of Avila, for example, who did not want to allow a convent in poverty because they felt that people would not contribute enough to keep the house alive, and they would become a burden on the public dole, that they would be a parasite on the civic government, siphoning away money that could be used for other things. Well, Teresa ignored that, bypassed them, essentially some would call she cheated to get the property purchased and the furnishings brought in with people that were working for her on her behalf, other friends and family members, and before anybody knew it, this convent was up and running without all of the technical permissions that people said that she needed. She did have the permission of the provincial, which of course makes the foundation quite legitimate in the eyes of the church. The details of her reform are, I think, well known to you. She kept the meatless diet and the strict enclosure that had been loosened by the second mitigation of the rule in 1432. The Pope had loosened up on those two regulations from the earlier rule. Teresa basically said, thank you, but we're not going to take advantage of those permissions. We're going to maintain the meatless diet and the strict enclosure. She also had the nuns simplify their habit. They got rid of their shoes, in some cases very nice, luxurious footwear, in favor of very simple hemp sandals of the type that were common among peasants working in the fields. She got rid of the idea of family names because, of course, family names always reminded the sisters of who came from nobility and who did not, who had a title and who did not. And so, since Teresa herself came from middle-level nobility, in the previous community she was always Doña Teresa. She insists from now on, I'm Teresa of Jesus. I'm not a noble lady anymore, because we're all equal in our service to the King of the universe. So the family names were not used. Always the religious names replaced them, and had a nice leveling effect in community dealings. She also insisted that the community be very limited in numbers. She started with 13 as her target number, that representing Jesus and the 12 apostles, but very quickly decided that perhaps a few more members of the community would not be bad. So she allowed the number to grow up to be maybe 20 or 21 or so, but still a strong, small community where everyone knows everyone else. As she said, everyone is known, everyone is loved, everyone is taken care of. Nobody gets lost in the shuffle, which of course is the basis for any good community. Now, Rossi finally makes it to Spain just inside his own deadline of 2 years. He made a courtesy call on the king, received permission to continue, and begins visiting the Iberian provinces pretty much in order of a geographic circle. He starts with Castile and Portugal. Both provinces are in very good shape. He does pay a visit to Teresa as well. More about this later. When he arrives in Andalusia, he found the Nieto brothers, the original criminal family, living in great luxury at the expense of the others in the province. The whole tenor of the Andalusian province was extremely foul. There were many of the friars who despised the Nietos and were hoping to overthrow them, but sadly the whole atmosphere the Nietos had created also meant that many of the friars who were against them were almost as corrupt as they were. So this is not going to be a good situation at all. Once Rossi sat down with some of the friars outside of the Nieto circle, he was able to get a very clear picture of what was going on. So he begins to turn the tables on the criminals. Please note that his real desire was that they be dumped from power, but not punished too severely. He was hoping that they still had the seed of good religious life that could turn them around into competent religious. Sadly, that was not going to be the case, but I think we can sympathize with his interest in trying to smooth things out and make Andalusia a more livable place. He replaced Gaspar as provincial with a better candidate. He arrested a second brother, Melchior, who had actually been accused of violence against a previous visitator. He had been essentially co-opted into the Carmelites after having been a Franciscan. Never got much in the way of Carmelite formation, and was probably the most blatant criminal of the three. Eventually, Melchior was simply expelled from the order altogether. Rossi decided to go easy on Gaspar and Balthazar, and allowed them to move to other houses. And since they were promising very good behavior, essentially he said, all right, nothing worse will happen to you, but follow your promise. Sadly, they did not. When Teresa and Rossi had their first meeting, the general was extremely impressed with her as a person and the experimental community that she had founded. So Rossi hoped that Teresa's seed community could be the model of what he wanted Carmel to be in Spain and Portugal. He gave her permission to found as many communities as she could, as long as she could get nuns to live in them. His actual words were, as many communities as you have hairs on your head. Well, Teresa's hair was getting gray and somewhat sparse, so she knew that she had to get about it, and did so with the characteristic energy that governed everything that she did. Rossi also gave her permission to found 2 houses of friars, because he saw that these nuns communities were going to need spiritual directors or helpers that understood their reform, that had a feel for Carmelite spirituality and heritage. So essentially he says, go ahead and see if you can convince some of the men in the Castilian province to join your reform and try to make good use of them insofar as possible. Well, she was going to do that. After the house in Avila, she's very quickly going to found one in Medina del Campo, 2 others in Malagon and Valladolid the following year. Fortunately, the whole tenor of the sisters living in her communities was so good that there was a flocking to join these communities. It was obvious these sisters were happy. They were living a very good form of religious life. Their prayer was good. They were inspirations to any of the people close to where their houses were. And so there were young women lining up and asking for admission. Within the next couple of years, she founded Toledo and Pastrana. She was under some pressure to make a foundation in Salamanca, the university town. She resisted that for a while because she was convinced that university professors and the people around them had money, but that they were a little too stingy to share it with religious communities. And she felt that if she built a house in Salamanca, that they would be very rapidly running short of money. It's interesting that Teresa never pushed the idea that her houses should be so poor that the nuns were lacking in anything. Basically, you can't fast with any kind of religious merit if there's no food. You have to have good food, which you could enjoy, and then voluntarily decide how much or how little of it you were going to take. She made that famous statement, you know, there are times for fasting and there are times for feasting. If the occasion demands that I have partridge on the plate, then I want partridge. God bless her. I love that attitude. Eventually, she made her foundation in Salamanca, and it was quite successful. All of her hesitation and doubt did not come true. And she just goes right on going all over Spain, making foundations. You might note that Rossi had told her, by way of caution, stay out of Andalusia. When you're making your foundations, make them in friendly places where you know that the friars are good and they're not going to contaminate any of your women's communities. Well, that worked and it didn't work. Among the best collaborators that she had from the early years, these were some of her closest friends, notably Anna of Jesus. She entered in the original convent at Avila in 1570, like all the others. Anna is going to be one of Teresa's best administrators. She was a highly competent woman who eventually is going to come into conflict with the Discalced general, largely because she's convinced that women can run their own convents, and the general was insisting that only the men can do it competently. So there is going to be a conflict there and some suffering. Maria of St. Joseph entered the house at Malagon. She was a rather lively, fiery personality, very flamboyant, that appealed to Teresa's fun side, and also a very close friend who was going to promote the attractiveness of Teresa's houses with people on the outside. Then there's Anna of St. Bartholomew. She also entered at Avila, came from a peasant family, could not even read and write until Teresa taught her. She simply entered the house as a lay sister, one of those who was perfectly happy to do the manual work of the house rather than being a choir sister and doing the official prayer in chapel. But Teresa essentially brought her along and lifted her up to the point where she was one of the most competent of her close friends. Anna of St. Bartholomew was with her when she died and took very good care of Teresa in her declining years. So we're attracting some real geniuses of religious life. From Rossi's point of view, he thought that Teresa's reform was superb, but he wanted to use it as a sort of leaven in the loaf. He saw that all of the Spanish houses, male and female, needed the good example that Teresa had. But he was also rather wary of the possibility that, like some earlier reforms, like the reform of Mantua or the reform of Albi, that these could become semi-independent congregations within the order that did not allow transfer between the reformed houses and the unreformed houses. Remember that Rossi was quite conscious that he was general of the entire Carmelite world, and that no house really should be exempt from a good reform. He was hoping to homogenize many of the reformed houses with others in need of good example. So from Rossi's point of view, a closing in of Teresa's reform or a separation between them and the others would be his worst nightmare. And yet, he also acknowledged that it was going to be an uphill fight to convince some of the people in the other houses, male and female, that their old way of life, which they had been living for X number of years, had to change according to the progress of the times and the reforms of the council. Obviously, he didn't want the nuns to get anywhere near Andalusia, because if they caught some of that rather toxic fever, that could destroy the entire reform. Among the first of the men to join Teresa's reform. The two that you probably know most about would be Castilian friars Antonio de Heredia, who took the religious name Anthony of Jesus, and Juan de Yepes Alvarez, who had been John of St. Matthias. He now adopts John of the Cross as his religious name. And both of these, together with others that will follow them, turn out to be very good chaplains, spiritual directors, confessors of the nuns. But remember that the sisters are continuing to control their own constitutions and their own finances. It's interesting that when the conflicts begin, it's not between the nuns and anyone else. It's largely going to come from some of the men in the order and the parent province. The first friar's house will open in Duruelo in 1568, and since Rossi had authorized 2 of them, another one was added in Pastrana, and then a third at Alcalá. The third house had not formally been organized under permission, but Alcalá was the university town where Cardinal Jimenez had founded his very good seminary for priestly training. And so when Rossi heard of the third house, he said, all right, we'll allow this one as well. So it's a legitimate foundation. But again, we're starting to get modifications in his original view, and unfortunately Teresa's as well. Now, these friars' houses were getting volunteers from all over the Carmelite world, and guess what? Balthazar Nieto, who was chomping at the bit in Andalusia and trying to get out from under all the restrictions that he'd been living under from Rossi, he decides that joining Teresa's reform might be a way of escaping from all of his restrictions. I mean, if I'm a reformed friar, he says, why should I have to go through all of these other unfortunate regulations? So without anybody really realizing it, Balthazar Nieto slips out of Andalusia into one of Teresa's Reformed friars' communities. And once that happened and several other changes, the friars begin to assert their own feeling that they need to protect and supervise the nuns' communities. Otherwise, there's no future. So Teresa, sadly, who was the heart and soul of the reform, is suddenly not necessarily in control of everything that happens. She's obviously very busy founding new communities, so she doesn't always notice when some of the power is flowing away from her. Rossi obviously has to continue the rest of Spain, get back to Rome, and start visiting other provinces. And he continues his travel in 1567. Once he's out of Spain, the Nietos counterattack to get themselves reinstated in their old position. The best way of doing that is to use their contacts in the royal court to complain about Rossi and some of the Andalusian friars who replaced them, and tell both the king and the pope that these were corrupt religious who had unseated them unfairly, and therefore they should be returned to power. Well, this is the time of the Council of Trent. Complaints about corrupt religious are going to be taken seriously. So both the king and the pope are going to pay attention, at least temporarily, to these accusations. You already know that King Philip is dying for a chance to tamper in the affairs of the Carmelites and the other religious orders. The Pope at the time was Pius V. This is St. Pius V, a former Dominican, a former inquisitor, and definitely a very rigorous disciplinary pope who's going to take this accusation quite very much at its face value. So, at least temporarily, even the Pope is going to seem to crack down on the Carmelite leadership. The king acts first. Once this series of complaints reaches the royal court about corruption in the Carmelites, the king appoints the Spanish bishops to investigate all of their local Carmelite communities. Send a representative of the bishop to visitate each Carmelite house, look at everything, try to ferret out all possible evidence of corruption or laxness, and report back to me, the king. Well, the result of that was absolute chaos. First of all, there's always going to be a different bishop for each Carmelite community, and they're not consistent. Each bishop and each bishop representative is going to be looking for different things and finding different things, most especially because bishops in this time as today do not always have a clear vision of what religious life is supposed to be. So you have unqualified people doing this inspection, and they're reporting back all kinds of outrageous things that may or may not have been true. Well, this is going to have the effect of angering every Carmelite community in Spain. They realize correctly that people who have no business in their way of life are interfering, and they're doing it officially. So there is such a huge outcry that within a few years, the Pope tells the king, please call your inspectors home. I will substitute 3 trustworthy Dominicans to do the job. Now, at least the Dominicans were religious. And since the Dominicans had helped the Carmelites form the mendicant version of themselves, they understood a lot about the Carmelite style of religious life. So Pius V is going to replace one set of inspectors with another. To give him credit, Pius V, like the other popes following the council, was good. Nobody, was able to accuse them of any kind of corruption or immorality, quite different from the popes from 100 years earlier. And they were all dedicated to promoting the laws and regulations of the Council of Trent. 3 notable ones for us and Teresa's reform: Pius V, Gregory XIII, and Sixtus V. All of these are going to have an impact on Carmelite life, generally positive, but there's going to be a lot of confusion in the middle. Pius V was a former Dominican. You might also note that he was the first pope to wear white, simply because he never changed out of his white Dominican habit, and popes ever since then have followed suit. Since he was a former inquisitor, he was very touchy about corruption in high places. And so if Prior General Rossi, even though he is the top-ranking Carmelite, is guilty of any sort of immorality, that has to be found out. Now, the Dominicans that he appoints are an interesting trio. The central province for Teresa's reform was still Castile. So Pedro Fernandez was given the task of visiting that province. Another Dominican, Francisco Vargas, was sent to Andalusia, and a third, Miguel Abrera, was sent to Catalonia and Aragon in the east. Essentially, Vargas was the only one that found anything really wrong, because remember, the other provinces were doing fairly well. Sadly, Vargas starts his visitation in Seville in the south and has the door slammed in his face because nobody wants to talk to him. Well, he decides that, sadly, Vargas was a bit lazy and he didn't want to press too hard, although he certainly had the power from the Pope to do so. So he simply came up with the idea that bringing in some of Teresa's reformed friars and putting them in charge in Andalusia would be the best thing. Well, remember, Rossi had said, keep the reform out of Andalusia. Well, Vargas overrules that. And his taste in who he brings is ghastly, because he brings Baltasar Nieto as his delegate in the southern province, one of the corrupt people who was the cause of the original trouble in Andalusia. So he has essentially brought the fox to take charge of the chicken coop. And it doesn't take very long until the entire province is in a state of open revolt. The outcry is so great, this after not even 6 months, that it's pretty obvious that Vargas saw his mistake and withdraws Baltasar's credentials. He replaces him with another reformed Carmelite. This is Jerome Gratian, or Gracian, to use the Spanish pronunciation. Gratian was a young fellow, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. He was right out of novitiate, 28 years old. No experience with governing or reforming, but admittedly a good person. So Vargas is convinced that if Gratian could get his feet on the ground, he could be a good reformer. But once again, without knowing a lot of the details of what's happening, Vargas ignores the fact that he's putting a reformed friar, although in this case a good one, to govern friars of both observances, reformed and unreformed. Now, Gratian's main agenda is to protect Teresa's reform at all costs, although there are more and more people within the order that are screaming that the reform is destroying their way of life. Well, Gratian wants to promote the Discalced system, even against the resistance on the part of some of the Andalusian communities. Again, there's that fear that Rossi was aware of and very sensitive to, that he had to go slowly to convince these older people who had been living one way of life, which they considered legitimate, into another pattern that was perhaps not going to fit what they were saying that they had committed to when they took their vows. Gratian had a lot of really positive qualities. He was very charming, well-educated, about as honest and guileless as a person could possibly be. Teresa just loved him to bits. They were very distant in ages. Gratian was much younger than she was, but that accounted for a sort of motherly interest that actually, I think, probably deceived Teresa at a time when her very good judgment almost never made a mistake. She at times saw mistakes that he had made and tended to sort of wave them aside as mistakes that, well, he's young, he'll outgrow that, he'll think better next year or beyond. So, you know, his inexperience let him off the hook to a certain degree when Teresa might have been able to give him a little bit more prudence in his actions. Strangely, nobody in Spain kept Rossi informed of what was going on. These were some rather major troubles that should have been communicated to Rome, but Gratian and all of the rest were so busy doing what they were doing that somehow the prior general got left out of the equation. Vargas had already messed up what Rossi had put in place, and he now complicates this by naming Gratian as the vicar provincial in Andalusia. Now, that's especially strange because there was already a provincial, Agustin Suarez, and without replacing Suarez, he's placing Gratian in a position of leadership. And Gratian has the impression that since he is operating with the authority of the Pope's own appointee, that he actually might outrank Augustine and be able to overrule the provincial. So, as though the Andalusian province didn't have enough trouble of its own, they're now having two heads that don't necessarily agree with each other on all the details of religious life. Gratian continues to fight with many of the friars of the south, and many of those are now beginning to complain to one another and to other Spanish Carmelites that the discalced reform itself was the fault of all of this confusion, that things were fine until Teresa came along and started changing things. So the chaos and the discord is starting to get blamed on Teresa and her Reformed Carmelites. Obviously, there was a lot of criticism of Gratian, and sadly, he deserved some of it. But Teresa still had clean hands. She wanted nothing more than good, devout religious life and honest prayer. And yet, she is getting the blame for many of these troubles. Fortunately, things begin to iron out at the death of Pope Pius V. His successor is Gregory XIII. He was not nearly as confrontational as Pius had been, and he felt that perhaps the Carmelites really should regain control of their own reform. So he thanks the 3 Dominican visitators, relieves them of their power, and throws the ball back to Rossi, hoping that he's going to be able to sort things out. Why don't we take a break here and let this sink in for a short time, and then we will resume to see what happens. Let's have a look at the condition of Spain at the beginning of Gregory XIII's pontificate. Gratian had already asked for help from the king. Once the Dominicans had been withdrawn, the reform was back in the hands of the Carmelites. And Gratian felt that he was under siege, that he was being sidelined, although that might not have been true. So he again asks for help from the king. His own family had strong influence at the royal court, so he got a good hearing. And at this point, the papal nuncio, Nicola Ormanetto, who had been appointed by Pope Pius, had already taken the reform under his wing, and even though this was not necessarily the policy of the new pope, Ormanetto, who was also a very good reformer himself, decides that he's going to defend Gratian and the reform. Rossi, at this point, was desperate for news of what was happening in Spain with the reform communities. He had sent letters to Teresa in October of 1574 and January of 75 asking for a clarification. He was basically saying, you know, I'm hearing conflicting reports about what's going on. What do you see? How can I help? But sadly, those letters did not arrive. Teresa never got them, so she was not able to reply. When Rossi got no communication back, he began to have second thoughts about whether he had trusted Teresa a bit too totally. He was afraid that maybe there was something he had not seen, and that Teresa herself, as some of the accusers had said, was part of the problem. So we have Ormanetto in Spain representing the Pope, who is backing Gratian at a time when Rossi was hoping that an appointee of his own could be taking over the supervision of the whole Discalced way of life. At that point, there is a general chapter at Piacenza in northern Italy. This is in May of 1575. All of the representatives of the Spanish provinces are fielding complaints at the chapter. Sadly, there were no Discalced Carmelites at the Piacenza chapter, simply because there was no Discalced province. And each province selects its own representatives, so there was no one to sort of carry the Discalced part of the argument and explain what they were trying to do. It was a rather one-sided argument. People turned to Rossi and said, "What do you think? What do you know about Spain?" Rossi had to admit, "I haven't had responses to any of my letters. I don't know what's going on. I hope it's not the worst." Well, the delegates to the chapter decide that Teresa needs to slow down and perhaps stop spreading the reform to other communities. They were not entirely certain of what had to happen, but at least at the beginning, Teresa was getting a lot of criticism that they felt was probably legitimate. They referred to her as a restless gadabout who was not at home in her community praying, as she had said everyone should be, but traveling all over the countryside, making new foundations and visiting old communities, trying to regulate both the male and female communities as much as possible. At this point, Rossi sends Teresa another letter. This one does arrive, and he recommends to her that she try to keep a low profile. He points out there are people here who are very angry at you. It might be a good time to disappear for a little while. So Rossi suggests that she select one of her communities, go there, stay there, do whatever creative work you can without leaving the building, and let's wait until this blows over. Well, Teresa selects her community in Toledo. She goes there and spends the better part of the next year in that community. Like so many busy Carmelites before and since her time, in many cases, travel and ministry and activity keeps people from writing or communicating their best thoughts. That's true in Teresa's case here. She had been so busy that she had actually written very little. She had already produced her autobiography, her life, and had gone through a second edition of it after the Inquisition confiscated her first autobiography and never gave it back. So her confessor said, why don't you write a second one and maybe change the tone of this one a little bit. So she had done that, and she had also composed the so-called Way of Perfection, which was a kind of a guidebook for her superiors in the various communities she was leaving behind. It was very practical work on what makes a religious community according to our understanding, and how to take care of the practical things that come up. Well, with her reduced activity now, Teresa is going to do the lion's share of the work on her two most challenging works. The Book of Foundations, in which she gives a kind of profile of each of the houses that she has established, and the real magnificent work, the Interior Castle, in which she traces what she sees as the 7 stages of religious prayer life going toward union with God. So in a sense, it was fortunate that she was able to have this time when she had to stay put and compose her thoughts together. We who have come later are certainly the beneficiaries of this good writing. At this point, the Piacenza chapter is still very angry with Teresa and Gratian and the Discalced reformers, and they name Jerome Tostado, another Carmelite, as the special representative and visitator to go to Spain and sort out the confusion. That was probably a measure that could have worked, but once again, King Philip froze Tostado's power. He was not given authority to do anything in Spain. This was largely the dealings of Ormanetto, the papal nuncio, and the complaints that were still festering from the Nietos and trying to make a joke out of anything or anyone that came from Rome. So Tostado was paralyzed, and Ormanetto replaces his mission to sort out the trouble by putting Gratian in charge of the reform and really all of the Carmelite life in Spain. Well, Gratian, well-meaning or not, is going to start making some substantial mistakes that are going to come back to haunt Teresa. His main concern, as you see, was the survival of the reform. So he continues to try to spread the reform gospel in the other Andalusian houses, but surprisingly, he ignores some very good legislation that the Piacenza chapter had provided. These were guidelines for Carmelite houses throughout the order, and how they should be changing, reforming, and
straightening out their activity. Gratian didn't touch any of that. And once again, Rossi is not being kept in the loop. The communication is down between Gratian and Rossi. Teresa keeps asking Gratian, why aren't you informing the general of what you're doing? Well, apparently Gratian thought that would lead to all kinds of interference. So there was no writing going on. As he sees a danger to the whole existence of the reform, he uses Ormanetto's authority, the papal nuncio's authority, to bring together all of the reformed houses, male and female, into a separate province. Now, he did not have the authority to do that. He thought that he did, and his argument essentially was, well, the whole reform is in danger, so legal or not, we're going to have to kick back. Gratian called a chapter to elect councillors for this new province. In effect, he was already functioning as acting provincial, so the councillors were all that were needed. And sadly, Teresa is not involved in any of this. She might have been able to head off a mistake if she had been consulted, but it's the old game of men know better than women, so we'll just inform Teresa of what's happened after we've decided it. The protector of that measure, Ormanetto, died in January of 1577. Ormanetto was certainly well-intentioned. There's nothing wrong with him as a person, but he was essentially keeping a barrier between the reckoning that had to come. There's a new nuncio named Filippo Sega, also a very good representative. He revokes the ban on Tostado's power as the Carmelite delegate, and Tostado is finally able to act freely. Now, after this time of inaction, he is hugely upset. He's angry, he's frustrated at all of the stonewalling that has been facing him. So he immediately suspends Gratian's power. He disbands the province that had been founded illegally, and he begins his own visitation of the communities in 1579. It's at this same period that John of the Cross is captured and hauled off to prison in the Toledo house for functioning as a confessor and spiritual director to the nuns at the Incarnation. John was essentially innocent of any wrongdoing. The Dominican visitator had legitimate power, and John essentially felt that he was simply following a legitimate order to take care of the nuns in this very important house. But the Carm critics of John pointed out that since he was following the Dominicans rather than the Carmelite superiors, that was disobedience and a major issue, and therefore they locked him in a small, almost airless room for about 8.5 months, and gave him the rather harsh treatment that was common at the time for any religious who had violated the rules in a major issue. This was quite unfortunate for John. He was nothing except an obedient, prayerful friar, but he got caught in this power struggle between other people who should have known better. But once again, John is restricted in his place and in all of his activities, there's nothing he could do except pray and write. So again, we're indebted to the fact that he was restricted for this better part of a year, because he did the lion's share of his work on the beautiful spiritual canticle and the better known Dark Night of the Soul. Much of John's writing was so profound that it had to be explained in poetry. And then, as some of his other writings indicate, he had to do commentary on his own poetry because not everyone was seemingly able to really understand it. Finally, John escaped from his captivity. I suspect that one of his jailers felt so sorry for him that he actually made it easy by letting his guard down. And John made his way to one of the Discalced houses. Well, up until that time, nobody knew where he was. So once Teresa finds out what had happened to him and where he had been for all this time, she was extremely angry, outraged at the poor treatment of a good friar, and she literally feels betrayed by the other Carmelites. You can understand why she would have reacted that way. A lot of other people did as well. At this point, Teresa concludes that with these two very separate observances of one Carmelite rule, the animosity had gotten so bad that she didn't see any realistic way that the two observances could live in peace. So Teresa begins to warm up to the idea of, again, separating the Discalced communities into another province, this time doing it legally with the permission of the general and the curia. Sadly, Rossi had died in 1578, and the new general is Giovanni Battista Caffardo. He really wants peace within the order. He was very upset with all of the animosity, the name-calling, the hatred that had been generated by this new movement. So Caffardo was not as vigilant as Rossi had been about separating out the reform to make it semi-independent. For Caffardo, that seemed to him like maybe a temporary solution, but a good one. So Teresa and the Discalced friars petition to Pope Gregory XIII to allow them to make a separate province. Prior General Caffardo has no objections. He said, this may bring some peace to Spain, and we desperately need it. So in 1580, we now have a Spanish Discalced province for both the men's and the women's communities. Teresa lobbied heavily for Gratian to be elected the first provincial. By this time, Gratian's popularity with the Discalced friars had slipped badly. Many of them felt that he was the type of restless gadabout that Teresa had been accused of being, and that Gratian was, for all of his political maneuverings, really not a good friar. So Gratian was elected the first provincial, but only by a squeaker. Without Teresa's powerful support, he would not have been able to get the votes. Fortunately, she did help them with the new constitutions for the province. She certainly was one of the most experienced Carmelites with legislating for a reformed community. So the input that Teresa gave the friars was quite valuable. Teresa herself will die in 1582. This is very shortly after the distinct province was declared. She had resumed founding new communities, but she was just worn out by all of her exertions and obviously the tension and anxiety that had accompanied all of the wrangling. So when she died, she had been very well cared for by Anna of St. Bartholomew, and she died hoping that the reform would eventually calm down and become the source of a renewal for the entire Carmelite family. She wanted a reconciliation with the parent order, but at this point her life was done. She had given everything that she had and done what her judgment had told her were the best alternatives. So she had nothing more that she could have done. After Teresa's death, you see a continuing gush of vocations into both the male and female communities. By 1595, there were 58 houses of friars, all of these in Spain, of course, and 34 communities of nuns, totaling 1,400 religious altogether. By the way, I should qualify what I just said. I said all in Spain. Spain had annexed Portugal in 1580, and there had been a successful foundation of a Discalced province, a mission in Mexico. So those three geographical areas were the places where the Discalced communities were alive and well. All of these were considered to be Spanish territory, so politically they still were all Spain, but the way that you and I look at the map today, they were in 3 countries, all of them thriving. The heritage that Teresa had left behind of these strictly disciplined lives, it was a source of terrifically good ministry on the part of the Discalced, and a great deal of zeal for proclaiming the gospel and helping to reform the Spanish church. The idea of foreign missions was also alive and well. The missions in Mexico were successful because they got good vocations almost immediately. They had made several other attempts to make foundations in West Africa, which unfortunately failed badly for a whole series of reasons that were beyond their control. But the principle of founding missions was alive and well at this point, but it was going to come under scrutiny. John of the Cross was also aging and ailing, getting less and less able physically to do much of what he was hoping to do, but he continued to work on his writing. His Ascent of Mount Carmel is sort of the counterpart of Teresa's work on a guidebook to religious life. He continued to revise and add to both the Dark Night of the Soul and the Spiritual Canticle. He had done the central work in prison, but he was now doing some fine-tuning and clarification. He completed his Living Flame of Love in a burst of energy in less than 1 month's time. Many people feel that this is one of his finest works, not always the easiest to understand, but much of what John wrote seems to be beyond most people's intelligence anyway. He was really just a very unique individual who represents the highest levels of spiritual development. We still have Gratian as the provincial of this new separate province, and it's going to grow by leaps and bounds with all of the preaching and the spiritual renewal that it promotes. The African missions were attempted in 1582, the Mexican mission 3 years later, and many of the Spanish friars are becoming famous for some of their ability to think ahead with how to form a foreign mission. In the following century, this is going to become very useful to the universal church, as we will see in the next lecture. By this time, there's going to be another major force within the Discalced family. This is Nicholas Doria. He was from the Doria banking family of Genoa, and therefore an Italian-speaking Carmelite. He had entered the Discalced reform in 1577. In his civilian days, as a banker and a financial manager, he had helped out King Philip with straightening out much of his tangled finances, and therefore the king owed Doria some favors, which Doria was quite eager to collect in later years. Unlike Teresa and John and Gratian, Doria believed rather strongly in very severe discipline, extreme austerity in ordinary life in the religious houses. He was very strict on a high level of observance, and for that reason he felt that Gratian, who, like Teresa, had been moving around quite a lot and occasionally begging off of the meatless diet, and more than occasionally missing formal prayer because of his activity. Doria really felt that Gratian was too unfocused, too much of a danger to the strict discipline that the reform was promising people. At the next provincial chapter, Doria was elected provincial rather easily. Gratian had lost his main backer at Teresa's death, and so Doria was quite eager to take the reins of power, and he very quickly reorganized the government of the Discalced province into what he called a junta, a committee of strict leaders cooperating together. Here's an interesting comparison in the views of these two rival provincials. Doria was one of the older style religious who had a great deal of pessimism and fear of evil. Gratian reflected Teresa's optimism and a basic trust in the good of well-motivated religious. Doria promoted the idea of personal sanctification that was endangered by a ministry that was overly active. In other words, staying at home in the house and not going out to do ministry in a wider circle was Doria's ideal. Gratian, like John of the Cross, had always been very busy moving around the countryside, working for salvation of any people they came into contact with. So their idea of a rather vigorous mission is going to be uppermost in their minds. Doria promoted severe penance as an essential government of spiritual growth. The thing about a great deal of fasting, personal discipline like self-flagellation with small whips, devices that induced pain, and a reminder of personal sinfulness. All of these were seen by Doria as genuine spiritual helps. Gratian, less so in that regard. He believed that a certain bodily penance that was moderate helped to remember Jesus' passion, but pain was pain, and not necessarily a good thing. Finally, Doria was a strong believer that women should not be running their own affairs in the convents. He felt that women were weak, changeable, poor judgment, and they could only thrive in their communities if they were governed by members of the male branch of the order. Gratian again reflected Teresa's idea that women are as redeemed and enlightened as men, and that since they had equality of rights, there was nothing wrong with their judgment and should be allowed to retain control of their government, their finances, and their choice of confessors and chaplains. Well, this is setting up a clash between Doria and the women's communities. He's going to try to write a new set of constitutions that would reduce the authority of the nuns, the autonomy to run their own affairs, and place them under the friars. Doria felt that the missions especially, and the external ministries that were not dependent on a church or a community directly, needed to be cut back. He allowed the Mexican mission to continue because it was obviously successful, but he enshrined the idea that the Discalced reform could not exist outside of Spain and Portugal, because people outside of Spain were simply not good enough or virtuous enough to be able to live the Discalced life. So during Doria's time, and immediately after, there was no expansion at all outside of the Iberian Peninsula, except for the Italian house in Genoa, which was Doria's hometown. And since Doria, being a considerable micromanager, wanted complete control over the Discalced reform, he started moving toward a complete separation of the reform from the parent order. He lobbied heavily to the Pope to allow them to have a Reformed congregation that was autonomous within the Carmelite family, this in 1587, and that was granted. Remember, this is Rossi's worst nightmare. And by 1593, he pushed for a complete break and an independent order by 1593, and that was also approved and granted. Now, there is going to be a certain amount of resistance to this, especially among Teresa's closer collaborators. You might remember Anna of Jesus, the very good administrator who was a close friend of Teresa's. She tried to defend the old constitutions that Teresa had superintended. She felt that Doria's new version that put the friars in charge was a betrayal of much of Teresa's reform. So Anna was deposed by Doria. She was put under house arrest in her own convent in Madrid, and replaced her with another superior that was more compliant. It's interesting that Anna had actually appealed directly to the Pope, in this case Sixtus V, and Sixtus decided in favor of the nuns. Well, that made Doria really angry, and he lashed back as hard as he could. He eventually had the Pope reverse that judgment by all kinds of very strong arguments backed up by the king. And Anna of Jesus was punished further. Both John and Gratian tried to defend the nuns as being the carriers of Teresa's legitimate principles. And so John and Gratian both came in for a share of the punishment as well. John of the Cross was given a transfer to the Mexican mission, but by that time he was already terribly sick and actually never left Spain. He died before he could go off to that mission. John probably would have been quite happy with that, because although he wanted to defend the nuns, he had no political aspirations himself. He just wanted to be a good friar, and he certainly lived and died as exactly that. Gratian himself, unfortunately, was not as fortunate. He's going to be expelled from the order in 1592. Doria pointed to his lack of solitude, his over-familiarity with the nuns' communities, the fact that Gratian always pleaded poor health for needing variations on the dietary regulations. So, that was enough to convince Doria that Gratian was not a worthy discalced friar, and so he was stripped of his habit and expelled from the order, and wandered about Europe for a few years before he found his way to the Carm community in Brussels. He lived there for the rest of his life, allowed to wear the discalced habit and live according to the discalced principles of life. And it's a rather sad end for someone who, although a bit unhinged at times, was still a good and sympathetic religious. So, Doria has now taken control of Teresa's reform. He's going to put his own stamp on discalced life. Although he didn't live very long after the separation of the order into an independent entity. He dies in 1594. His successor is Elijah of St. Martin, who was a very kind, conciliatory person, very much a peacemaker, and hoping to renew the spiritual side of Teresa's reform and reduce the animosity and the hatred between the two branches. Doria had definitely put his own stamp on the very strict observance of the communities. He actually spoke for a large number of the friars at that time. It's interesting that many of the rank and file of the communities agreed that Gratian was a disruptive force from what they had grown to expect. Many of the ordinary friars felt that Teresa had promised them silence and solitude, and Gratian was trying to tear them away from that by runaway ministries. So restricting their activity to within the house seemed to be the better solution for many of the friars at this time. So Doria was actually speaking for the majority of that opinion. Fortunately, this return to austerity was not enough to squelch the very joyful spirit that Teresa had put into her teaching and her writing. That comes through in spite of the the toughness and the strictness, and they are both characteristics of Descalz's life at this time and in the subsequent centuries. So this brings us pretty much to the definitive end of the reform and the split of the order in Spain. The non-reformed houses are still in desperate need of the kind of reform Teresa could have given them if she had lived longer and had a free hand. So we're going to have to wait for the next century before the parent branch of the order is able to pull this together. But they will successfully do so, have no fear. Now, as our wrap up for today's lecture, here is your key question. Recall how Teresa restored Carmelite life in her own time, using both the rule and her own insights and experience. Then, fantasize a bit. In your own imagination, design a valid and helpful formula of life for a lay person or a religious person living in the 21st century that you can base on the Carmelite rule of St. Albert and 800 years of wisdom and development. So in essence, I'm asking you to, in your own mind, write a new Carmelite rule that would be valid for today's world and appeal to young people and old people of today. It's a flight of fancy, admittedly, but it might be a fun exercise. Some people these days ask the question, was Teresa a reformer or a foundress? Well, I don't think the question is very enlightened. She was probably both, and even more. Teresa was a reformer because she took an existing rule and an existing order with spiritual practice, and she brought it back to its original fervor. But at the same time, she created something brand new that had never existed, especially in her more specific style of prayer. And for the most part, Teresa is going to contribute to the richness of Carmelite life, not by creating something that is distinct, but by taking the old and renewing it, making it new, making it absolutely glowing in the appeal of the Carmelite virtues. So that's what I think about this for the moment. What you think is equally important. So discuss this with your friends or your religious community. Think about it yourself. Keep it grinding in your mind when you're falling asleep, and perhaps the Lord will give you some good dreams with more inspiration. Thank you very much. We'll see you next lecture.